Good afternoon. Hello, everybody. Welcome at the second keynote session at the 4th Southeastern European SDEWES Conference. Just to inform you that this session is recorded and at the same time is streamed live on YouTube. I have a pleasure and honor to introduce our speaker today, Professor Poul Ostergaard, who is a professor in energy planning at the Department of Planning at Aalborg University, Denmark. Professor Ostergaard holds a master and PhD degree in energy planning, the latter with particular focus on integrated resource planning and the organizational structure of the energy sector. He has conducted research and authored publications on energy planning since 1995 and has been project manager, work package leader, or participant in a series of research projects mostly centered around large-scale integration of renewable energy sources and the development of renewable energy scenarios. He is the program director of master degree program in sustainable energy planning and management at Aalborg University and has been involved in various other teaching and training activities, notably energy system analysis, workshops in Denmark, Nicaragua, Jordan, and Malaysia. He is also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Sustainable Energy Planning and Management. Paul, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Natasha. Thank you very much for the very kind introduction. I will just have my video camera on just for a short while I say hello. You might say that my topic of work, as you outlined, is probably one of the most important topics in the world today, as I see it. It is about energy systems. It is about how we can develop energy systems towards renewable energy systems that are not harming the climate. So basically, in order to not cause global havoc, we need to change our energy systems. In my presentation today, I will look into some of the issues of this and some of the solutions. And I hope that I will find something interesting for you to say, or for me to say. Also like to thank you for giving me this opportunity to share some of my thoughts, and I think it's a great occasion here at the Sarajevo, or whatever we should call it, conference. I'm sitting in Aalborg. So we have an opportunity to meet and discuss these matters, regardless of any pandemic. But I hope you'll enjoy, and I hope that I will have a lot of, or that you will have a lot of questions for me afterwards, so we can have an engaging discussion. So I've made a very detailed agenda for this presentation today. What was, what is, and what will be. As you'll notice, what will be, it is not quite what you expect. It's maybe I should rather say what might be, because I will look into some of the historical developments. I will look into what is the energy system that we have today, and then I will look into some of the solutions. What might be, both in terms of how can we change the energy system, but also how can we make the accommodations that can facilitate the changes? How can we make sure that we get an energy system that actually works in the future? I might come with a small story. Whenever I go to a family reunion, there will always be an uncle asking, so what are you up to these days, Paul? And I'll say, oh, I'm working with renewable energy. And then he will say, yes, but have you also considered what happens when the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing? And I can assure my old uncle that this is actually one of our primary concerns. I mean, it's one thing to deal with too much wind or too much sun, but it's another issue to deal with too little wind or too little sun. So yes, that is a matter that is being worked with throughout the entire community, as you are all aware of course. I will, in my presentation, go a little bit further back than most presentations probably do, because I want to put the human energy consumption in a little bit of perspective. So let's move on to what was. In historical overviews, history often seems to start with the oil crisis of the 1970s, or in case we're dealing with real history buffs, then it might go all the way back to the Suez crisis of the mid-1950s. In my presentations, I'm trying to put things in a bit wider perspective. I've chosen to include an even longer time perspective to probably demonstrate some of the significance of energy to human development. So let's go back to the monkeys and the Neanderthals. Life, well, if you look up what life is, it's about metabolism, reproduction, and other factors. If we focus on metabolism, or rather catabolism, in case there's any biologists who may have wandered in here today, humans, we use about 170 kilojoules per kilo per day. That is something like 2 watts per kilo. So for a guy like me, that's about 160, 170 watts that I'm using of energy. But this, of course, is very dependent on temperature and activity levels. It also applies to other members of the family. It applies to the other primates. If we take the man in the middle there with the spear, analysis of Neanderthals show that an estimated energy consumption of 320 watts. So that's double my energy consumption, distributed evenly on food. So back to the 160 I use, and fuels. And basically, these guys would die of loss of food if they dressed the way we see on the photo there, because there's simply not enough biomass to be harvested, or rather there's not enough food to be harvested in the area, and it would simply not be sustainable. So you would really need to eat a lot if you're dressed like that. So already at that time in history, humans have resorted to biomass for actual combustion, for burning, to heat up your body, to actually ensure that you don't need to eat so much that you will put a too large strain on the resources where you're living. So through firewood, the Neanderthals, they could lower the meat requirement significantly and basically enable a more sustainable living. And the use of energy has been a prerequisite for living in a temperature or for cooler climates like this ever since, and also, of course, today. Energy use beyond our immediate dietary demand, that enables us to stay warm, do more work, and to shape the world that we are living in. So, while at first energy use was mainly renewable and the technology was simple, it was fire, it was beasts of burdens for labor. I found a nice image of beasts of burden working for humans. This is not an ill attempt of air cargo, but it does show that we have used beasts of burden, and thereby, of course, we've had some energy use through our beasts of burden. Later, of course, we stopped simply relying on biomass, and we started using fossil fuels, and things really kicked off when we started using fossil fuels, both for traction, mechanical processes, for electricity, for heating, and whatever. So throughout history, energy has been a prerequisite for human development. And today, the metabolic energy demand, that is about 1/20th of what we actually use in total. So we have something that we need to simply keep our bodies going, but we have a very large energy consumption outside of that. That's a term that I found a term for a few years ago, exometabolism. Unfortunately, I also found out that a Russian did the same in 2007. Otherwise, I would have been happily taking credit for that term. But I think it pretty much demonstrates that we as human beings have a very large energy consumption outside of our immediate dietary demands. Going to a more recent past, we can observe some trends depicted on this chart. It does not show the full time range I would have liked to show because it's difficult to find these time series that extend for very long periods, but it does show an increasing trend in population, in GDP, in energy usage and CO2 emissions. Note that the GDP is increasing at a higher rate than the primary energy supply. So we do not really have a decoupling. Rather, we do have a nice coupling between all the different factors still. If I did do a little bit of the noble art of energy data archaeology, and I found data showing that in 1970, the energy demand was about 8 times higher than the demand in 1900. So energy demand is increasing with the economy, and associated CO2 emissions are also increasing heavily. And this is of course of concern because, strictly speaking, economic development is good, but all the associated effects are not. Let's take an opportunity to focus on the world today, and with a bit of focus on Denmark, but also on other countries. If we look at a number of different countries, we will see this trend that I indicated before, that we do have a tendency of an increased primary energy supply when we have an increased GDP. So there's a link. We also have some outliers. Here we have South Africa with a modest GDP with a high energy demand. We have at the other range, we have Switzerland with a high GDP and a modest energy consumption. So there's not a law of nature saying that as economy increases, energy demand also increases, but we do have a tendency. And of course, there are differences between different countries, which I'll come back to here. This is an example of Danish energy supply over the last 30 years, where we can see that the stable PES at the top, it has been, well, not entirely stable, but it's been fluctuating between 800 and 900 and decreasing a little bit below also at times, but rather constantly just above 800 petajoules for the last 3 or 4 decades, basically. And this is in spite of various trends. We've had some trends calling for an increase in energy demand, prosperity, changes in residential patterns, smaller families, more square meters per person, more equipment per person. But at the same time, we've also have had efficiency improvements. We've had changes in the production sectors. Basically, some of the heavy industries have moved outside of Denmark, and that of course also explains why, when we're looking at a chart like this, you can't really make that comparison directly, because I guess Switzerland has also gotten rid of some of their heavy industry, which might have moved to other countries. So we have some tendencies there. At the same time, however, the renewable energy proportion in the Danish energy system has increased, and by now it's about 300 petajoules out of approximately 800 petajoules. So we have seen some very large changes, and looking into some of these more explicit changes in the Danish energy system, anyone who has ever given a presentation about the Danish energy system has had a look at this map, because it shows very good indication. This map here shows what the Danish energy system looked like in 1985, so 35 years ago, where all the green dots are wind turbines. We have some orange dots, which are small local CHP plants, and we have some large red dots, which are the large central CHP stations. At this point in time, mainly coal-based. And we will see that wind turbines are everywhere, or scattered everywhere at least, and we have some CHP plants, but mainly, and here of course you need to know Denmark to see this, but mainly in the bigger towns. If we move ahead in time, we will see a picture that is what I would call the worst nightmare of any TSO. You literally have hundreds of small-scale CHP plants which are not under the control of the central dispatch, and you have thousands of wind turbines which are of course producing according to the weather. And if we had a more updated map, you would also see a lot of PV panels. On this map, you also see some of the offshore farms, both to the east and to the west of the main peninsula that you have in the middle of the map, where we have several hundreds of megawatts by now. So what was done in Denmark was that power generation was moved to where the heat demands were in order to use the cooling heat from the power generation for house heating. That is district heating. But of course, this introduces an extra lack of flexibility in the energy system, because your heating demand may not necessarily follow your electricity demand. So if you have to produce the heating, then you will have to produce electricity at the same time, and you might have some issues in that respect. So all in all, it's been a tremendous increase in complexity for the Danish energy system, and probably a complexity unrivaled, unparalleled throughout the world, maybe with exceptions for a few small island systems. If we look into wind power alone, because here we have had a really strong development, also caused by the very large increase in offshore wind farm. We have a growing share. Here I'm showing data for the western part of Denmark. We have two different systems in Denmark, one which is synchronized to Scandinavia or to the rest of Scandinavia, and one which is synchronized to Central Europe, continental Europe. So looking at the data for one of these areas, we will see that the wind share has increased significantly, up to more than 50% over the years. And at the same time, we have had an increasing number of hours where 100% of wind power has been covered, or 100% of the electricity demand has been covered by wind power. That is the blue-green line. And you see here the last 5 years, we've been lying around 1,200 to 1,400 hours per year. So that's something like 15% of the time of the year, we actually have more wind power than we can actually use in the electricity system. And of course, this is also something that can make a TSO become very nervous. It's also kind of data that indicates that a focus on renewables, and it indicates which focus we've had on renewables, and it's a kind of data that also presents this professional challenge that I indicated earlier from my talking with my old uncle. And it's really something for energy planners, system analysts, and people engaged in the energy transition to focus on, basically. To show just how it can look like, this is a bit old. This is a 5-year-old data, so but we've actually not had that large wind penetration increases since then. But this shows simply a week where we have the electricity demand indicated by the red dashed line, and also the wind power by green, and the small scale CHP plants by blue, and the large scale CHP plants by yellow. And basically the blue and the green, they are pretty much outside the control, except for some of the very large wind farms. They can actually be controlled, but it is production that is dependent on the whims of the local CHP plant operator, and on the wind, and also, of course, also today on solar production, whereas the yellow is something where you have a direct control of the production. What is interesting in this particular week is also, we actually had a hurricane here, and we had another hurricane. So hurricanes more than 30 meters per second, which is actually not so good for wind production. Well, you do see that we have some peaks there, but we also have a number of wind turbines who actually shut down for self-preservation. So we actually have another peak there, which was not a hurricane. So that also means that the wind turbines did not necessarily shut down. So there you can actually have a peak which is higher. So we have to have a system which is sufficiently robust to accommodate these very large peaks caused by heavy winds. On the other hand, we might also need to have a system that has have sufficient flexibility for these lows. Maybe we should have a name for that in the future. As we name hurricanes, we should have name for periods without wind power. Another last thing I want to mention on this one, that is actually between these two hurricanes, where you have this trough, where there's absolutely no wind production, or rather only about 500 megawatts, which compared to the other hours of more than 3,000 or close to 3,500 megawatts is next to nothing. So that is a tremendous strain on the entire energy system when you suddenly have to accommodate such a very large drop in electricity production from wind turbines in the matter of a few hours, basically. So these are some of the challenges that we have in the Danish electricity system as it is today, and I'm focusing very much on the electricity. Of course, it's also focused on matter for the energy system, but for the energy system as a general, of course, you don't have these very large problems with balancing the system. So what might be, what will be, what might be? If we look at the options for energy production under Danish conditions, or doesn't have to be Danish conditions, but most other places on this latitude, it is difficult to base an entire energy system on electricity. So we need something else than electricity. We have sources fluctuating according to cloud coverage, solar inclination, wind speed, direction, temperature, and these are all beyond human control. Of course, solar collectors are very good at producing hot water, nice for a shower, not very nice for running a TV set, so we need something that can help us generate electricity. Photosynthesis, which is used for producing biomass, is about 30% efficient if you actually have the correct wavelength and only counting the photons that actually interact with the leaves. In reality, biomass has an efficiency of maybe 1/10 of that, so about 3% of the solar light is actually converted into biomass. So biomass is a very poor harvester of energy. Solar cells, solar collectors, they are much more efficient than biomass. So unfortunately, of these ones I have here, biomass is the only one that is actually produced in a storable form, but we also have multiple competing needs for biomass. We have, of course, as we already spoke about before, our dietary demands. Basically, we need food, direct human ingestion. We need fodder, that's animal feed, animal ingestion. Typically indirect human ingestion because we typically feed our animals to eat them later. We need fiber, building material, wood in the current situation. We need fertilizer, both actual fertilizer as we're producing it from natural gas today or from nitrogen from atmosphere, but we need a very large production of fertilizer, but we also need to have some biomass in the actual soil, so something has to be left there. We have feedstock, we have the entire plastic industry, pharmaceutical industry, which is today basically oil-based and therefore fossil fuel-based, and in the future that cannot remain, so then we need to change that into biomass also. Forests, well, we can't cut down all the forests to simply supply our needs. We have biodiversity needs, we have habitats for animals, plus of course we also have indirect values for humans, recreation, bequest, existence, all these terms. So it does have some value for humans. So we have a number of different demands for biomass, and I've not even mentioned the last one. That is the last F on the list, fuels. So the other ones here, we can't really replace them. So fuel comes very last on the list. And when we're looking at biomass resources that are available, we need to take into consideration the needs for all other areas. We have a small biomass availability, and we must use it wisely, and only a small fraction of that is available for, or not a small necessarily, but only a fraction of that is available for the energy system. We have large fluctuations of the power availability when we're talking about PV and wind, but also talking about other renewable energy sources like wave power. We have potentially very large imbalances, and at the same time, we are actually looking into an electrification of the energy system. Electricity is, in fact, quite an inefficient. This is a chart I drew a few years ago, simply indicating what are the losses along the way from a South African coal mine to, I have light here in my office. This was based on an incandescent light bulb, a filament light bulb. So we see we have actually losses in excess of, that's, I think it was 97% losses we had all the way from coal mine to electricity in the light bulb, or for light coming out of the light bulb. So we have extreme losses along the way. But in spite of that, we are still looking into an electrification of the energy system. For the heating sector, we're looking into heat pumps combined with energy savings, that is improved climate screens for transportation. We should also use as much electricity as possible, if not directly, then indirectly through power to X, hydrogen, methanol, whatever. Industry, same deal, electricity where possible, otherwise some kind of power to X. And basically everywhere else, it should be electricity or something based on electricity, so that in the future, our energy system will much more be dependent on PV production, on wind turbines, on CSP, concentrated solar power, on wave power, what else? And a lot of them are of a fluctuating nature. So if I revisit this week here, where we had the different power productions and the electricity demand, and I superimpose the Nord Pool electricity cost, or the price on the spot market for this same week, we can see that there is some link between the electricity production on wind turbines and the spot market prices. And of course, it also depends on the demand for electricity in the different time perspectives. So if we look into, for instance, the peak, the unnamed hurricane I had in the middle, there's a low in the electricity prices. If I look into the second hurricane just after the trough, there's also a low, and then it even gets lower. And on Monday, when there's no wind production, there's a peak in the electricity prices. So in the future, we're going to have even more wind and more PV. And as it is today, we're using the electricity market, and if we don't have any changes, I foresee that we will have a tendency like this, which is even more pronounced. Later I will show some of the issues in deeper. But we have an integration issue. We have the matching of the demand and supply. We have some market issues, and the last thing is that we have some investment issues. So moving back to the market issues, sorry, we have some other barriers, but I'll not go into them, just to indicate that is not a all-encompassing list I have there. But going back to the electricity market, these are the electricity costs of the spot market prices in Denmark for an entire year. And here it's plotted against the wind power production. This is not a formal regression analysis, but there's a tendency of lower prices also when we look at it on a yearly basis, and higher prices when we have less wind production. So it does also show that there's a decreasing incentive for investment in technologies fitting into the electricity market, that is PV and wind power. So basically, if we're changing the electricity system simply by putting more wind turbines and more PV into the system, they will be out competing themselves. They will lower the prices, cause less profitability and less incentives for producing. If we take the duration curve, we do see that we have some very low prices and some very high prices, but mainly it is centered around 200 Danish kroner, so about 30 euros per megawatt hour. Cheap electricity is fine. It does cause some problems. So we have the issue that I just mentioned, investment basically. If you're out competing yourself basically by producing or generating electricity on units which are typically bidding at zero, there's an issue there. We have some other issues, some of the integration issues. As it is today, people are looking very much towards heat pumps for producing heat, but actually heat pumps are so efficient that they can actually bid in all hours on this duration curve and still have a profitability which is higher than if producing heat from biomass or from natural gas CHP, for instance. So it is in fact very cheap to produce electricity on heat pumps. So that means if they are able to produce regardless more or less of the electricity price, then we do not get very much flexibility on those. We have another issue. We have some backup technologies that we need, and that can either be biomass-fired CHP stations, it can be some more novel technologies based on fuel cells in the future. We will run into a problem that they might have too few operating hours to simply account for their financing. So if they have to rely on the very few hours with very high prices, well, that is not really going to provide sufficient incentive for their investment. As it is, whenever I read a student project, they always have an idea of putting various technologies in, heat pumps, hydrogen, whatever, and they should all take the very low costs. They should all take the very low prices. They should all operate, for instance, when we have negative prices in the market. But of course, that will not happen. I mean, the more you put in of units relying on the low prices in the market, the more they will push up the level in the electricity market. And that, of course, is a good thing, looking at it from the side of the technologies actually providing the electricity. So something that can keep a certain minimum level on the electricity prices, that is something that we are going to need. So in general, we need an electricity market where wind and PV do not lower the price too much, where bidding is not necessarily the short-term marginal that sets the bidding price, where demand stabilizes prices, so we have to have some units coming in with flexibility that can help stabilize prices in the market. We need something where thermal facilities, or whatever, it doesn't have to be thermal facilities, but that's as far as my imagination runs, but something that can provide our backup. They should be able to operate, but they should also be able to not operate. So they have to have sufficient economic incentives to exist and operate for the few hours that are unnecessary. We need the flexible technologies to supply the required flexibility, so they can't simply run baseload as the heat pumps will tend to do today. And in terms of forecasting in the spot market today, you typically have to be able to forecast your production within the next, or for the next 12 to 36 hours. And that, of course, puts a special burden on some of the ones that are simply based on wind or wind power or solar power, sorry. That it is simply not possible to foresee that or to forecast that with as high accuracy than if you had a fossil fuel powered station, for instance. So we need to have an energy market, and especially an electricity market, that takes these matters into consideration. We also have some investment issues. Here's an example of a cost breakdown for an energy strategy that we made for Aalborg municipality. And I'll not stress the difference very much. We have the vision and the reference. The vision is a renewable energy vision. The reference, that is basically business as usual. And you'll see that they are at comparable levels in terms of total cost, but the composition is very different. And if we're talking about socioeconomics, we will have money leaving the area when we are having the reference situation with fossil fuels, whereas money is actually being spent inside the area when we have the system based on renewables. But how do we get there? We have a shift from modest investment costs and high running costs to high investment costs and modest running costs. And that's one of the typical issues with the transition to renewable energy systems. And of course, especially if your new technologies are competing against existing technologies with some sunk costs. One thing which is happening right now, and which is, for instance, affecting the installation of heat pumps in buildings, that is the drop in oil prices, where prices, they are quite low at the moment. Those of you speaking Danish or German, you'll understand the word billig. Also, you see in the US, for instance, the sale of poor mileage cars has actually increased over the last years. So people, they are not buying energy efficient vehicles. They are buying the gas guzzling kind of vehicle. So we have some issues there simply because of low fossil fuel prices. During this spring, we've even had negative prices on fossil fuels, believe it or not. Looking at it from a larger time perspective, again, this is the fuel oil price. We can see how prices for actually many years was relatively stable. If we look at the dark green curve up until the 1970s, then we had some peaks with the oil prices, some lows again, and some very high peaks. And as I just mentioned, we've actually had negative prices recently. So what does that mean? Investors, what they want, amongst others, that is a profitability over a certain threshold, but they also want certainty. So if you are investing in a wind turbine or some generating equipment and you are competing against an oil price, which you will do in some countries, well, of course, if the oil price is reaching more than $100 per barrel, that's nice. But if you don't know whether that cost is going to drop to half that level within the next few years, then you're operating under very uncertain circumstances. I have another case that is from the Danish history, where we installed a lot of CHP plants in the 80s and the 90s, and they were planned under an assumption of increasing electricity prices and stable fuel, that is, natural gas prices. But that is exactly what did not happen, because electricity prices, they fell, amongst others, due to the large expansion of wind turbines and later also due to PV panels. And at the same time, natural gas prices actually increased. So they were based on one set of conditions and they were met by a completely different set of conditions. So we need some financial certainty and some motivation for public investments, also a low discount rate for assessing the feasibility of investments. Maybe we should have floor prices for fossil fuels. I personally think, for instance, that we should have an adaptive tax on gasoline and diesel for private vehicles so that the price will never drop below a certain level, and simply take that as a fiscal income to the state if the price drops too much. We should also have some market adaptation as touched upon before. Integrating renewable electricity into the market from a more technical perspective, it's about matching supply and demand throughout the year, here indicated by the frequency. Of course, the frequency, that is an indicator of whether we have balance in the system. I'll discuss a few different solutions to that. Interconnection. Here we have Denmark in the middle. And in an analysis I made a few years ago, I analyzed what were the implications for the energy system if I combined the Danish wind stock with similar wind stocks displaced at various differences from Denmark, and thereby with delays in when they were affected by wind patterns and how they were affected by local patterns in the areas they were. So basically I was interconnecting Denmark to other countries and seeing the effects on the Danish energy system. And when I did this analysis, I was probably a little bit too conventional and still believing the conventional wisdom that interconnection works. So I stressed that there was a small and discernible impact. I mean, it was actually better for the Danish electricity system if we combine it with wind turbines in other countries, but it was actually a very small effect. So this leveling out of wind production due to the distance, it had an effect, but it was very marginal. And basically, it does not work. It is not the solution to anything. That's from a technical perspective. Then electricity trading. Trading is also seen as the answer to everything, but there are limitations to the appropriateness of this approach. To the extent that we can find a trading partner with an energy system which is different from ours, then it could work, as it does today. Trading should be among unequals. However, if we look at these two guys, imagine how much they will sell to one another. I imagine that they will not sell very much to one another. That also means that if you take a case of countries with similar pathways, we can take Denmark and Germany. Both are investing in wind turbines, PV, there's CHP and district heating in both countries. Basically, we have the same to sell, and not only that, we will try to sell it to one another at the same point in time. So not much trading can be relied on for saving anything there. We also have other neighbors to Denmark. We have Norway, you have other countries which are neighboring other hydro-powered countries. There, of course, you do have some trading possibilities because you have unequals, basically. We have a PhD student here who has actually analyzed to what extent Norway can be used as a battery for all of Europe, and it is probably not surprising that a country of 4 million people cannot basically have enough hydropower to balance a continent of 500 million people. So the possibilities that we have from these countries does not really suffice in providing sufficient flexibility. We have flexible electricity demand, and that has a little bit of potential. If we look at some ballpark numbers here, a house will use between 3,000 and 5,000 kilowatt hours per year simply for the ordinary electricity demand. If we have heating in a house, then it will be some 5,000-6,000 kilowatt hours per year for space heating and domestic hot water. If we are using heat pumps, obviously this is mainly in the winter. An electric vehicle, something like 2,000-3,000 kilowatt hours per year. So we have some demands. If we look at the conventional electricity demand, there is a very limited flexibility in load shifting. And I had a PhD student analyzing this for an article, analyzing how much can be shifted and what will the impact be of that. And the impact of that is indeed very little. So we need to integrate across demand sectors. We need to have the house heating. We need to have the electric vehicles including. And that can actually provide some flexibility. Of course, there are limitations, as mentioned, the heating demand in the houses, that's mainly in the winter. The electric vehicle, well, it has to be connected, but luckily vehicles are not used very much. I think I've seen numbers saying that they may park more than 95% of the time, but of course they have to be connected to the grid to have an effect. So we're moving towards the smart energy systems where we are relying on different energy sources, we're relying on different demand sectors, and we are relying on the flexibility that we can have throughout the energy system, and thereby also relying on some of the cheaper storages elsewhere in the energy system. Basically a heat storage or cooling storage or fuel storage is orders of magnitude cheaper than electricity storage, and typically also more efficient. So to the extent that we can use storage elsewhere in the system, this is what we should do. But this of course requires that the energy system is very much more combined than it is today. We're not simply talking about district heating and CHP. We are talking about production of electrofuels, producing hydrogen, for instance, for cars based on wind power, and at the same time producing heating for houses. So a much more combined system. I'm coming towards the end of my presentation. We're looking towards a very much electrified electricity system based to an even higher extent on fluctuating power production. We cannot rely on trade with our neighbors to solve the issues. We need to have something different to sell. We need to have trading among unequals. We cannot rely on geographical differences. They do not provide sufficient variability or flexibility for the electricity system. We need to activate the flexibility in house heating and transportation. And when we do that, then we also have more control of when we actually try to trade internationally or locally. Whereas in a system like today, you are basically trading when you're forced to trade. You're not necessarily trading when you want to trade, but simply because you're forced to trade. But if we activate the entire energy system, then we can transfer into systems where trading becomes an option and not something you're forced to do simply because the sun is shining or it's cold outside or the wind is blowing. This brings me to my final slide. Thank you very much for listening, and I am open for questions if anyone has a question.
Thank you very much, Paul, for a very insightful presentation. We have two interventions in the QA box. One is the proposal from Neven regarding the name for the case when we have wind not blowing. He says we use word bonanza from Italian bonanza, I hope I pronounce it correctly, which actually has different meaning for calm or dead calm, which is real Adriatic bonanza when sea is like a mirror. So it is a proposal for the name you look for. And the second is a kind of question again from Neven. What is your take on decarbonizing grids? Please, Paul.
Well, I'm not sure I fully got the second question. My take on decarbonizing the grid, or what did you mean? Or what did you say?
Gas grids.
The gas grid. Okay, let me simply, as for the name, which is the important question, of course, Neven, I think every load should have its separate name so that you can say, do you remember when Aretha took the roof off the house? And you can reply by saying yes, but do you remember when Frank made it so that we had to cook over a wooden stove for a week because the wind was not blowing? So different names for different periods. Just kidding. Then for decarbonizing the gas grid, well, I think we need to we should decarbonize the gas grid as quickly as possible. I mean, we have large discussions in Denmark right now. Denmark is a large natural gas producer, and there have been filed for permissions for further extraction of gas. And of course, I think that most of the fossil gas that we have today needs to remain underground, as with other fossil fuel sources. So we naturally need to decarbonize the gas grid. I think we can use it for other purposes, to the extent that we are producing electrofuels of a gaseous shape and form for power production. But I do not foresee that we will use the gas grid to the same extent as we do today. I think fuel use for cooking, for house heating, etc., should not be based on gases in the future. I think that should be based on electricity. I think gases are simply too valuable for the energy system to use for the purposes that we're using it today. It's simply too high quality, and we need to use it for either transportation or for backup fuel for electricity production, not for cooking spaghetti or for heating houses, providing low temperature heat, basically.
Thank you, Paul. And even if you want to reflect on Paul's answer, you can take a word. I would also like to remind the other participants they can use this QA and QA box for questions, but also you can raise your hands in a chat box. So Neven, you need to reflect on the answer.
I'm not sure if I'm going to produce cacophony because I'm running from two different systems. Yes, I agree with Paul about the first question. It happens so rarely on a European scale that we need names. I have been following it for last 2 years and it just didn't happen. So I'm waiting for it to happen, and then we should give them names. The second question, I also agree with Paul, so no need to further reflect. I think decarbonization of gas will mean much less gas, but there is a strong pressure from the gas grids to keep the gas infrastructure.
We have problems in Denmark also, because actually it's quite difficult to get a gas grid out of a town and get a district heating grid into the town, because you really have to, as a district heating company, you have to show extremely good profitability before you are allowed to actually do that. I was just at a meeting yesterday where we discussed a town where Aalborg District Heating, the district heating company of my town, they are expanding into this area. So it's a town of, let's say, about 4,000 people, but they were actually quite eager to get rid of their gas boilers and switch to district heating. And about 50% they had already agreed to switch to district heating, basically because they are getting an energy system which it's future-proof, because they don't have to care about the transition. And it is simply more simple for them. They don't have any technical installations apart from maybe a heat exchanger for the domestic hot water and some valves.
We had an earthquake in Zagreb, and gas heating destroyed half of the city because of falling chimneys. And
Yeah.
I proposed to remove gas and replace it by district heating. And well, there are some positive support, but it will be very difficult because the gas is a very powerful lobby, and the pricing is not always obvious because currently the state is paying for retrofit of the gas installation, so it's actually fossil fuel subsidy.
Yes, yes, I agree on that. It's an interesting angle about the earthquakes. That's very interesting. But yes, I do think that in some countries you have a very strong gas industry that is really protecting their market. I think it's to some extent, it's easier in countries where you have a larger public interference or ownership of the gas sector. I think there it's easier to impact it, because this is really something that we need to phase out sooner rather than later.
Okay, and I think that now we can take the interventions from the QA box. We have a question, Paul. What would be additional perspectives on how flexible operation can be best prioritized to support the penetration of renewable electricity generation until it reaches 100%? The second one.
Can I take one at a time?
Yeah, please.
I'm actually in the middle of writing an article with a colleague of mine where we're looking into how can we change the tax system so that you are increasing the incentive for flexibility providers, for instance, heat pumps, to use electricity when the wind is blowing and not use electricity when the wind is not blowing, basically. I think it does boil down to economic incentives, that you really need to use the carrot and the stick even more. The carrot, low taxes, low prices when the electricity is from renewable energy sources, and in the current system, you really need to put higher taxes when the electricity is not from renewable energy sources, or in the future when you have a strain on the production, for instance, when the wind is not blowing. And of course, we need systems set up for the entire automotive sector. I mean, we need to have some standard solutions so that if you buy an electric vehicle, you can indicate that you simply leave it to some operator to play with the battery, as long as you have, let's say, a 75% charge on Monday morning, if that is what you need. So we need some standard solutions. We need some operators, some actors in the market that can provide this for us. I don't know if this provides the full answer. For heat pumps in houses, I know that as it is, they're very efficient, so you don't get any incentives. So again, they need the incentives, the economic incentives, but also for the individual house owner, the incentive is probably too small. I mean, even if the electricity was free when the wind is blowing and not free when it was not, they would not get sufficient incentive. So there you might have to pool them and have one company in charge of bidding a number of heat pumps into the electricity market, so that basically you are not, as a house owner, you are not operating your own heat pump. You are simply maybe buying the heat from some industrial actor who can act on your behalf and just make sure that you have sufficient heating in your domestic hot water storage, and that your house has a sufficient temperature, but you will leave the operation of the heat pump to someone else, and they make sure that they operate in the best way according to the spot market. I hope that was sufficient for the first question, Natasha.
Okay, Paul, the next one is not question, but a comment from Professor Antonio Piacentino about my pronunciation of Bonazza. Yes, thank you, Antonio. And we have also a question from our most loyal SDEWES participant for this year, Dr. Unveiler, Stanislav. He compliments your presentation, wonderful presentation.
Thank you very much.
You summarized that we need heavily electrified electricity systems. What kind of load is being talked about here? Can these systems handle this load? Paul, can you reply, please?
It cannot hold. My colleague Henrik Lund, he actually made an analysis of what would simply happen if we electrified everything, basically. Also electrified the heating without heat pumps, and you really need to have a little bit more varied perspective on things than I maybe presented on that slide. For instance, if you took out district heating and said that all houses, they need to be electrified for heating. That would really put a strain on the grid system. So when I write that the heating should be electrified, that is probably not correct. I should have written that we should have district heating and then electrification, because yeah, otherwise the grid can simply not sustain that load. Yes.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Now I'm giving the opportunity to all the participants who have asked questions to reflect on the answers. Please, if you have a reflection, raise your hand or take a word. Okay, if we don't have interventions from the floor, I have just one question, or maybe it's a comment, which maybe it's not relevant for Denmark energy system, and but maybe it's more relevant for Southeast European countries, where we have very heavily fossil fuel being subsidized. So besides this mechanism of putting a floor on fossil fuel price, I think that phasing out of the subsidies, fossil fuel subsidies, is another important mechanism for creating enabling environment for renewables, particularly when we, in the cases when we have fossil fuel produced electricity, coal produced electricity heavily subsidized through the hydroelectricity, which from the plants which have been already repaid. I don't know whether you can reflect on this.
I can only say that I wholeheartedly agree on what you just said. I think it's a real problem when you have subsidies on fossil fuels. I can of course understand that in some cases you have subsidies on fossil fuels, not for energy security issues, but rather for social issues. So I of course understand that there is an issue there. It's the same with, I mean, oil producing countries from Venezuela to Iran to Saudi Arabia selling petrol at below world market prices to the local population, which is more like a social matter than an energy matter. So I do see that we have an issue there, but we really need to get away from subsidized fossil fuels, or at least maybe it has to be very transparent how much money is actually being spent on subsidized fossil fuels, so that it's not a decision that is simply taken and forgotten, but it's something that decision makers and the public has to be very much aware of. And yeah, I think it's a problem with subsidies for fossil fuels, but you have the same issue also in other areas.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Paul. This brings us to almost to the end, but before that, I would like to announce that another very important agenda item, that is the other invited lecture scheduled for today by Dr. Marina Babic-Mladenovic about river engineering in Southeast Europe. And you have just 1 hour to grasp your well-deserved lunch. I want to thank Paul and all the participants in the discussions and all the attendees for Paul to his very insightful presentation, and also all the other participants for wide discussion. And see you later on the next invited lecture scheduled for 13:30. Bye-bye. Have a nice day.
Bye-bye, and thank you very much.